welcome to Sharing is Caring, the fifth in our series of Urban Transport Next Conversations with a live online audience on topics that will help shape the future of urban transport. So whether you're spending your lunchtime with us listening live or listening later to the podcast or on YouTube, thank you so much for joining us. So I'm Becky Fuller, I'm Assistant Director at Urban Transport Group, and we're the hosts of this ongoing series of conversations. And if you don't know us, we're the UK's network of city region transport authorities serving over 20 million people. And our job is to make sure transport can play its full part in making our city regions greener, fairer, happier, healthier and more prosperous. And I'm really pleased that so many people have signed up to take part in today's event because we've got a really great lineup of speakers for you. So our chair this afternoon is Gillian Annabel. She's Professor of Transport and Energy at the University of Leeds. Gillian's research looks at reducing carbon and energy from transport, and in particular the future of the car, including new mobility services, the psychology of car ownership and the concept of car usership. And on our panel, we have Greg Marsden, also from the University of Leeds. Greg is Professor of Transport Governance and an expert in climate and energy policy in transport. His research looks at place-based approaches to decarbonising transport, and he's also the co-chair of the Commission on Travel Demand, of which more later. And we're also joined as part of the panel by Richard Dilks, Chief Executive of Como UK, which is a charity focused on the public benefit of shared cars, bikes, e-scooters and rides. And you, the audience, can also be part of this conversation. You can submit questions via the Zoom questions box. Please keep them short and sharp, and you can also upvote your favourites. And Gillian will be picking these up in the final 15 to 20 minutes of the conversation. You can also use the comments channel of the Zoom call, and of course you can tweet us at UTG_UK and join the conversation using the hashtag UTGNext. So I'll now hand over to our chair, Gillian Annabel. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm really pleased to be involved in this conversation, and not least to be the one asking the questions. It's a nice position to be in as far as I'm concerned, and particularly as we have Greg and Richard here, two real experts on this topic, and we should have a really lively discussion. I'm going to just set some hairs running with a few questions initially. And as Becky said, if you can put your questions in the Q&A, I'll keep an eye on them and bring them in a little bit later in the discussion once we've got through a couple of my questions. So I'm going to start by asking both Richard and Greg to just introduce themselves, just talk a little bit about their background, how they come to be involved in this topic area before we get into the substance, just by way of introducing themselves. I'm going to ask Richard to do that first, if he doesn't mind.
Not at all. Thanks for having me. Always get slightly worried when I'm described as an expert. The bad news is the wallpaper behind me, but the good news is it's getting done next month. So if you ever have me back, you won't have to suffer this twice. Apologies. How did I get into all this? So I'm Chief Executive of Como UK. We are this charity for the public benefit of shared transport, that's social, economic and environmental benefits. And we're also a collective body in the shared transport space, so working very much with authorities and operators. My background's with transport for quite a while, more public transport and infrastructure in previous role, which was for a business group called London First. And there I saw I think really the sort of end of the first wave and through the second wave of shared transport innovations passing through London, got interested in the sheer liveliness and dynamism of that sector, which frankly stood in pretty stark contrast to public transport, vital as public transport is. But, I think with rail, you can sort of pop in every few years and check if much has changed and have a little debate about how to do franchising or whether it's nationalisation and smart ticketing, and you could go away again and come back in 5 years and have pretty much the same debate. Shared transport, that just literally isn't possible. The landscape moves, really does move much faster than that, much more fundamentally, which brings a challenge, but, I think is also very exciting.
Great, thanks Richard. Okay, and Greg and I are close colleagues at the Institute for Transport Studies, but I don't know how he would describe himself as being here right now talking about shared transport.
Yeah, or indeed whether you're going to mark my answer as to how how well you think I actually answered the question. But yeah, so well, I guess I'm here today because I co-chaired the Commission on Travel Demand inquiry with you, Gillian, and Jonathan Bray was one of the commissioners on it, on shared mobility, where now and where next. And why did we pick that as one of our kind of topic areas? So we'd looked at overall changes in travel demand, and then we went to shared mobility next. And the reason is one that you and I spend a lot of time shouting, haranguing, writing, researching about, which is that we've got to decarbonise, and in a hurry. And I think one option that is open to us, if we really wanted to take it, is to share, because we use our vehicles today in a really very inefficient way, both in terms of the volume of assets that we have, but also how we use them when we have them. It would require quite a lot of policy and social adaptation, but it's all doable and within reach. So that to me feels like a great opportunity. But I think Ali Clubban, who set up LiftShare, came to the inquiry and told us that he's built his business up in spite of, rather than because of, a supportive policy environment. So why is it that we find, really getting behind shared mobility so difficult? So yeah, that's why I'm kind of here, and why I'm so interested in this, because I feel it's really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely spot on as far as I'm concerned too, and we'll get to this idea of what a supportive policy environment might look like in a little while. But I think probably the obvious place to start is to think about the fact, or ask the question as to whether the pandemic has really interfered with the trajectory that we were on in this country for shared mobility. So I suppose my question is, where were we pre-COVID, and what have the implications of COVID been?
Gillian, should I come in on that?
Yeah.
Sorry, Greg. So I think we have a paradox on our hands here. So where we were in terms of shared transport was both pre-COVID was both at generally all-time highs, which is obviously happy news for the decarbonisation point. Also, there's a whole set of interlocking benefits that shared transport brings: reduced congestion, reduced number of cars as it goes to decarbonisation, but also to just quality of place, to air quality, levels of activity people have in their lives, physical activity, and so on. So we were at an all-time high, but we were still relatively marginal. And I think we're at this phase of evolution where we are now at something that is mass scale. So Car Club total membership in Britain is now at around 600,000 people. Active membership is just under 200,000. That's people who've used it in the last year. Of course, that starts to get us into the COVID effects, because those are up-to-date figures. So, of course, COVID's had a disruptive effect on that.
How does that compare, Richard, though? So if it was 200k last year active members, is that down on the previous year, or is that still a bit of an increase at least?
Proportionally, yes, but there's a complicating factor, isn't there, always, in that increasingly car clubs have moved to a non-paid membership model. So if we wind the history back 5 years, then you had to pay your, let's say, £70 to join for the year, and then you paid on the basis of use. Of course, flipping the cost base around from private car ownership, which is partly why it's a powerful tool to cut people's mileage, which we find again and again. But quite a lot of the big schemes have moved to a free membership model, which then, of course, boosts the total membership number. So this is why we are now talking about total and active, to try and give us a clearer picture as we can. And bike share also, as I know we're here to talk about Top Gear and car share, but has also been doing well. And I think if you look at the e-scooter trial responses, the per day ride rate in those schemes and so on, it's actually all looking pretty healthy. This is something people like and they use, and is growing in scale and reaching critical mass. But it's really a sort of first base kind of critical mass in a baseball analogy. This is the bad news. We're still in this world where it is marginal. I know exactly what Ali Clubban means in that quote from Greg there. And we have yet to see any of the really big piece policy moves that we could see, both in a more general decarbonisation sense, particularly about private motoring, but also in a more specific sense of what could shared transport do more of if it had a more supportive environment. We're working on those. It's not a uniform picture. Some parts of Britain are doing better than others on this. Scotland in particular has been marching on very well in the last 18 months, 2 years. Wales has suddenly, dare I say it, woken up to this. Its transport strategy just published really has quite a lot of shared transport positive content specifics in it, which is really welcome to see, something we pushed on. The current guidance on electric vehicle charging, which currently excludes shared vehicles, mind-blowingly, is something we're trying to work with the Office of Zero Emission Vehicles to revise. So there's lots of sort of hopeful irons in the fire, and I'd say COVID's shaken up the policy environment for shared transport in rather a good way, because I think when you have a shake-up, if you're on the margins, it's probably more likely to benefit you than if you were a kind of central incumbent. So there's lots of things that are moving quicker and in a more positive direction. But if you look across to, say, Germany in particular, the Netherlands, lots of Belgium, we're a long way back in terms of per head of population use, availability, promotion, incentivization, provision, other factors like mobility hubs where things, sustainable means can be gathered together as partly as a way to suppress private car parking provision, and so on. Long way to go.
We do. And just before I come to Greg, and I don't mean this to sound pessimistic, but I just want to ask in this way. When we talk about technical innovations, often we talk about the prospect, the dire prospect of things not working out, falling into this sort of valley of death. So you talked about sort of it being still on the margins, and that perhaps the critical mass still isn't there. Is there any danger that it's still not at a level yet here where it's here to stay? Is there any danger that this could be a disappearing trend?
No,
it's here to stay.
You might say, I would say this, wouldn't I? No, I don't think there's an existential threat here. Although I would caveat that slightly in the sense of the impacts of COVID on shared transport have been varied depending on what kind of shared transport we're talking about. So car club use as a generalisation has held up. Of course, it's been a roller coaster ride, but public transport's been much less available, of course, and shared transport has benefited from that. Bike share in particular has benefited from that. In certain places, it's on an even picture. So not too much to worry on that side of that. But the lift sharing type of shared transport has been devastated by COVID, of course, and it's still something that it's an activity that is currently not allowed. So that's a very different picture. So I think for lift sharing, there's a bit of a different point here of how do we get that back up, as it will be coming back up from zero. Other forms of shared, that's not the case. I don't think that existential threat level. I think the risk is much more just inaction, and that yes, growth continues, but it continues rather despite the ecosystem than because of it, and therefore we just don't get the level of impacts that we could get.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and we're definitely going to come to some of what that ecosystem needs to be. But Greg, do you want to comment as well on the trajectory that we were on and that we're now on? And can I just ask you, because it's occurred to me as Rich has been talking, that we haven't actually defined what we mean by shared transport in this webinar so far. Can I just ask you to sort of give a overview of what we're including under that banner?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think it's sharing of access to assets and sharing of those assets in use. So the latter would be the kind of lift sharing or perhaps more of the kind of bespoke demand responsive transport type arrangements, whereas sharing of the assets is access to bike share, shared e-scooters and car club type vehicles. And I think Richard's always he's already pointed to this. Those markets they actually serve really different purposes, and COVID's had a different impact. So there is a risk of kind of seeing kind of COVID is bad for the shared transport economy. Well, it's definitely not an even picture. And one thing we said in the Commission's report was we should look at promising use cases. And I mean, Richard's right, like we've lost a lot of employment trips, and people have been advised not to share vehicles and so on. So you could see that as all negative, but actually in the survey work that we've done, it's done quite a lot of sorting of those people who are driving and reliant on cars, and those people who've got more flexibility in terms of what they can work. And that's really important for the long term. So I think our survey, and you correct me because you've been crunching the numbers lately, 44% of people carried on driving to work pretty much every day during lockdown. They tended to be the lower income people, more likely to live on the edge of town with poor public transport accessibility. So for them, services like Tandem, where the workplace or the groups of workplaces are collectively delivering a solution, that points to a really strong opportunity to me, or that's where they should be targeting their market. And then we've got 50% of people who are working from home a lot more or exclusively. And Transport Focus put out a report in the last week which said that whereas 2/3 of rail commuters used to do it 4 or 5 days a week, they think that's going to be as low as 21% when we start going back to work more. And if the same sorts of numbers potentially hold true for car commuting, you know, it's not all or nothing, but it's that in-between ground that's really important. Then the dynamics of owning a car, which is not in use every day, or buying a season ticket, which is not going to get used very much, change. And I think that creates some spaces where shared mobility could become significantly more interesting. So, it is a mixed picture.
Yeah. And can I just ask you, just before we move on to really looking at the positive, I just want to sort of iron out any wiggles in this. I mean, before COVID, we were, as a general trend, looking across car use, at least, we were seeing on average car occupancy fall. So, why do you think that was happening? What was going on in our transport and car market to mean that we're using even less cars even less intensely as we've gone on over the decade? Because unless we sort of understand that, and that sort of trend towards the individualization of the car, then we need to understand it in order to address it.
Yeah, so I think the average car occupancy is 1.55 before the pandemic, and it's fallen, but it's fallen, I would say, relatively slowly over like 2 decades. And I think part of that will be the changing structure of who owns cars. So we're still in that 20-year period, moving into one where more of the vehicle fleet, relatively speaking, is owned by older people. So they're by definition living in smaller family units, and therefore more likely to be making single occupancy car-based trips. So that could be a factor that's playing into it. When we look at the trends from the other direction, lower driving license uptake, younger people not coming into the car market quite as strongly as they had done previously, that they would all, I guess, have been more likely to have been in lower car occupancy. So there's trends moving in both ways. So I think it's actually quite hard to kind of nail down exactly what's going on with the car occupancy figures. But what I would say is there's really not an awful lot of good data on car occupancy. It's like we've just not bothered with it. We've been totally focused on how to optimize the movements of bits of tin, not the movements of the people in them.
Yeah, absolutely right. Okay, let's just cast our eye elsewhere then, and Richard, I'll start with you. Just ask you about where you think it has gone right and is going right. whether that may be here in you mentioned Wales, Scotland, but elsewhere, where are there some success stories and what are the ingredients that have led to the success?
Yes, thanks. Just on the last bit to lob in a couple of thoughts there, because it might stimulate sort of debate later. I think we've just also got a lot of cars we've got to recognise, haven't we? More than we've ever had before, 38.8 million of them. And I was looking at the figures the other day. I mean, it was the 1990 figure was 27 million. So it's an extra 11, 12 million of the things knocking about. And, if anyone's following John Serow of Jacobs on LinkedIn and so on, he's endlessly posting up fascinating transport data. And one of his graphs last week was the real terms cost of everything over the last, I think, 25 years. And of course, it shows motoring going while rail does that and bus does that, roughly speaking. So, we shouldn't be sort of terribly surprised, sadly, about this sort of thing, I think. But then we stack it against government's declaration on 78% cut on 1990 levels on greenhouse gases by 2035, which brings things forwards and so on. So there are things to tilt at and be positive about here. Gillian, sorry, will you repeat your question? We're roughly breaking.
Yeah, so just let's look to where there's been good outcomes.
Yeah, so a bit of a composite answer, I think. It's a bit like the, in heaven, the Italians do the cooking, the Germans do the organising or whatever. So, I think on, if you want to look at, for example, mobility as a service in action, that concept, where's that been translated? I would say Berlin is the lead there. There you have the one app to rule them all, so you don't have the intra-app competition going on, inter-app contribution going on, and the confusion for users. Therefore, there's just one. But it's once you're in that, it's plural. So it's not just a public transport app, which is where a lot of it is still stuck in the UK and elsewhere. It is finding a way to work with the private sector providers also and curate that and present that to people in a fairly coherent set of options. And it includes cars, which I think is also where this falls down. It just tries to ignore cars, or at best it has taxi in there.
But generally speaking, my understanding is that in places like Switzerland and Germany, where for car clubs at least, the success has been around, or the growth has been around for quite some time. That partnership, even if not with the more up-to-date sort of apps and integration in that way, but that partnership between the car clubs and public transport operations has actually been quite a key ingredient to success.
Yes, and also I would say. So if you look at Munich and what they've done with taking out private car parking provision and giving people credits and incentives to use the shared car fleets, that's another version into that. If you look at Bremen and what they've done on mobility hubs as a way of gathering sustainable options together, also while taking out private car parking. I'd say on the sort of micromobility side of it, Tel Aviv and the Israeli cities stand out for the sheer speed with which they've gone in and put parking zones and then corrected them if they turn out to be in the wrong place, and that sort of fail fast to succeed model, something we could really learn from. I think US cities actually, somewhat surprisingly perhaps, have some of them have really stolen a march on this, and perhaps now with the new administration there federally, we'll see some catch up at federal level. But they've really, marched on with mobility hubs, with changing parking criteria, with gathering options together. And I think particularly the social inclusion side of things is something the US is much stronger on than even actually continental Europe, and certainly than the UK. So, well-designed programs that spread coverage into areas where the market won't want to go, but the market has to go there because that's the only way it's going to get the license to operate in the bits that it does want to go to. Those sorts of trade-offs, much more action on that, and on closing around funding loops to provide provision in those areas, cross-subsidised in various ways by the more lucrative areas. So it's a hodgepodge of different, bright spots around the world.
One of the things I haven't ever understood is that for conventional public transport, the operators know their market is often in neighbourhoods where car ownership is lower, and where we might be talking about socially excluded people, and that's their sort of target market. why has that not been a target market for car clubs? Instead they seem to have been built up in relatively wealthy areas, yes, with maybe parking pressure and lower car ownership, but nevertheless the demographic has been very, very different. And is that really because these are the people that use it, or just because that's the sort of received wisdom rather than anything else?
A couple of points here. So in that comparison, it's a fascinating question. First point, I think, has got to be subsidy. So we've got to recognise that the public transport operators in those spaces and so on have a large amount of subsidy as a generalisation to be operating in those areas. And I think very worrying sort of big picture thing here is what happens to public transport economics and finances, because we know that impacts on shared transport, and all of that inter-impacts on decarbonisation and how do we get there. But anyway, there's no subsidy essentially for shared transport. So will it make a commercial return or not is the test. And there's been a lot of experience over the years where going into areas on lower incomes doesn't make that return, which is why operators have tried things and then retracted. But I think this is a classic of where the policy environment can really move those viability milestones. You could do it through subsidy, of course. That's the equivalent of marching onto the pitch and grabbing the goalposts and running off in a different direction with them. But there are also subtler things that could be done. So where's the communications package that goes around to everybody living in that area to really promote and keep on promoting the shared transport options? Where's the incentives package that could go alongside that? The first few uses are free, whatever it may be. How do you gather these things together at the community facilities, the places where people are going anyway, rather than just begrudgingly allowed to have one space that's tucked away around the back of nowhere that no one can find and is more likely to be vandalised? There's a whole set of factors there, and really it'd be great to see authorities and operators able to work together on, here's our problem, here's our test case, how do we go about tackling that, what inroads could we make here, how do we work with maybe greater public transport provision going into an area alongside parking restraint, perhaps, for example.
That's great. Okay, we'll come back to some of that, because there's some questions definitely coming through about rural areas, mobility hubs, and so on. So we'll come back to that. But just give Greg a chance to talk about sort of his notions of success, where he thinks has happened, and the ingredients for that.
Actually, I'm going to defer to Richard on this one. I thought he used some of the examples that I would have given of places that are doing well. As I say, there's no one place that does everything.
No, the only thing. Yeah, go on.
And I think we have to, really design it for our own context, and not obsess too much about what's happening elsewhere. I mean, pick those ideas up, but the UK market and environment is quite distinct. So are the incentives around car ownership and so on. So what works here is going to, I think, be a little bit different.
And I think we have to think as well, though, you mentioned, excuse me, earlier about different use cases. It's easy to sort of think about the private car ownership, or hopefully shared ownership models, but we are talking about fleet vehicles as well, and sharing in that context. We're talking, as you mentioned earlier, Richard, not just about cars, but about bikes and e-bikes, e-scooters, and so on. So each of these things has, as you're saying, different contexts where they work, and different ways in which they need to be supported or not. So yeah, it's actually when you get into this it's actually a huge topic area, isn't it? It's got a lot that we could be doing and thinking about. So let's just talk about some specific policy mechanisms. You've alluded to some of them, but what is it that is really missing from policy if we can sort of be quite sort of almost list some of the things that absolutely need to happen to galvanise and accelerate these trends. Richard, start with you again.
Okay. Well, implement all the recommendations in the credit report would be a cracking start. So I won't traipse through those, but Greg's already popped the link in the chat, and I certainly say to everyone that is well worth a read. That set of recommendations, and it gives you really quite a good pen portrait of what this different world might look like, which is not 180 degree different from where we are now, but it is significantly different. Some specifics we've been pushing on. There's a job, I think, for central government to think about what it's doing, and that it is a wide-ranging job, so it strays off into some thorny areas. Tax is an obvious one. The tax system with regards to motoring, ultimately will have to be reformed because of the shrinking amount of revenue that will come through on the existing basis. We all know that. But to put a shared transport spin on it, there is no consideration of shared transport in the taxation system currently. So I mean that both in the sense of everything is geared through either a public transport lens or a you own the transport asset lens, and actually, of course, shared is neither of those, so it falls down the cracks there. There are no specific incentives towards it of any kind there. And there's also then various packages of things which don't touch shared simply because shared hasn't been thought of when the package is designed. So then, this takes us into, for individuals, but also the fleet side of things, so how does it stack up fiscally for employers of all kinds? And just think of big employers right across public and private sector. So that's one aspect of what really should be a whole package approach to employers. I think, for example, looking to measure them on scope 3 emissions, so that all transport to, from and for work is counted in emissions measurement. There should be something there bespoke, I think, also for the NHS, given its sheer size. The percentage of road journeys which are for the NHS in one way, shape or form, which is significant in its own right. Largest single employer in Europe, after all. There's absolutely nothing there. And we're having lots of conversations, very typical conversations Connect UK has, where we are finding sort of people who are interested in our space or getting to them, and then trying to work with them to deliver some bottom-up change fundamentally. But it is, again, change despite the system rather than because of it. So instead, let's change the system to empower that sort of change, those sorts of efficiency gains. There's a lot there if you look across the pool fleets, so these are the vehicles owned by these big institutions, but also then the grey fleets, so the allowances money paid for people's use of their own cars but while travelling for work purposes. So there's a whole sort of work package there. There's a tax package there. In terms of just transport policy and all that DfT itself can control, there's actually a lot to tilt at. I touched on OZEV and EV charging aspects. There's also the incentives on organisations like Highways England, Network Rail. Some of this is fleshed out in the credit report. But currently these organisations have no incentive to prioritise around decarbonisation, no incentive to look at vehicle occupancy, no incentive to provide more sustainable modes, no incentive to work collaboratively with entities in their local areas to plan their network to be the leanest and most efficient possible. Things are on the move a bit here. Network Rail's got a parking and design manual out for bids at the moment, which features mobility hubs, for example, that we've been talking to them about quite a lot. So things are shifting a bit, but again, from bottom up, why can't we have the government say to Network Rail, this is now part of your job is to worry about how people get to and from the station, not just the on the train, on the track bit. And I could go on.
I'm sure you could. I'm going to pick up just one question in the chat because I noticed it, and also it's a question that I have as well. You've mentioned mobility hubs now a couple of times. What are they? Yeah. The question from Roger Geffen is, I'm familiar with Como's UK's graphic of a hypothetical mobility hub, but I still don't have a clear mental picture of what mobility hub would look like or how it would work in practice. And I found this as well. The Welsh Transport Strategy has concerted, defined mobility hubs as a network of mobility hubs as something that it wants to implement. But again, without any real sense of what that is. So are these hubs different again according to where they are? You mentioned Network Rail, but there's rural areas where they're being talked about. Are they actually quite a various sort of set of types of physical entity, or what are they?
Yeah, well, in a nutshell, what we mean by it is somewhere where public transport option or options, shared transport option or options, active travel option or options come together. So this is in some designed way that is obvious to the user. They think, I am at a hub here. There's a collection of things. It's not therefore some things which are nearly in the same place, but not really. So that, if something is 400 meters away with no signage, that we're not saying that's a hub. So it's something gathered together with a bit of public realm improvement. It's a very heterogeneous concept. It's really flexible. So you can be talking here about an augmented bus stop, in effect. So we have the bus stop, we have good walking route to it, we have one shared car parking bay, we have some private cycle parking, we have a sign that identifies as the hub, and that's typical of lots of the Bremen mini hubs, which they have a very large network, many hundreds of them now. Or we can be right up to the other end of the scale. We could be huge coach interchanges that we see in the Netherlands, or very interesting end of S-Bahn or U-Bahn networks in Germany that then have shared car pickup drop-off and taxi provision to get people into the rail network, along with cycling and so on. So it's really flexible. The sort of danger of that, I think, is then that we get lots of things get the word hub stuck on them without a clear definition as to, well, what do we mean here and what are we trying to achieve? So we've tried to work with that. We have an accreditation standard for hubs, bronze, silver and gold, right, which goes across 6 typologies that we've identified. So these are both different sizes, but also different locations. So trying to account for urban, suburban, peri-urban, rural. That's, not pretending that's the last word on the topic, but it's something that we hope is helpful to people in their thinking and gives them a standard that they can achieve and say they've achieved and prove they've achieved. We're also doing some work on the business models behind these, which finds a very lively area. So we can move on to what is it, so go to the, well, who owns it and who funds it and what's the capital revenue mix, and am I going to be left with the white elephant on my hands in 5 years' time? So we're doing something on that too. So we're trying to strike a balance, as I think lots of other sort of players in this space are. So Keith posted in the chat about the one extant hub that we have in the UK so far, which is the North Greenwich one in London. We're trying to strike a balance between being flexible and inclusive and adaptable in the future, but having something that's high quality and clear and is genuinely delivering on these goals, and isn't lipstick on a pig or isn't just not good enough to really attract people to use it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Greg, over to you on what you would say are the real key policy recommendations. You can read off the Creds report if you want to, or prioritise them. Perhaps you've come to other views since we published.
Well, I guess Richard touched on cost. I'd be interested to know what you think about this, Gillian. But for me, the cost drivers seem to be going the other way with EVs, because you've got a really significant upfront cost and then a lower per mile cost. And we have got to electrify, but that to me is going to be a market dampener for sharing in certain demographics.
The fact that EVs are a greater upfront cost is interesting, though, isn't it? In the sense that is there's a main barrier to uptake of vehicles and could play into the car sharing. Except, of course, most people lease their vehicles and pay for their vehicle monthly. So an upfront cost is kind of completely diluted, including upfront vehicle excise duty, which is wrapped into those things. So those, this is a real change, I think, that has happened in the car market recently to facilitate ownership rather than sharing.
Yeah, we continue to channel quite a lot of public subsidy into individual ownership models. So again, well, is policy what you spend your money on rather than what you talk about? If it is, then I think we've still very much got an individual ownership mindset. So I think my focus is on like things that we could do, things that are really in the hands of government. And I still think that not giving Highways England a mandate to increase vehicle occupancy on its network is ridiculous, because we're spending money potentially on widening and increasing the inefficient use of the network asset. So not that I generally think in the next decade we've got any headspace to be widening anyway, but let's make more intensive use of the asset in the next decade and see what we could achieve, and that may change our future investment portfolio. Richard touched on Scope 3 emissions. I think we don't have to necessarily regulate for commute emissions to be part of businesses' portfolios. I think a lot of businesses are going there anyway through their kind of climate change commitments. So it's an open door with big companies to work with them on sharing applications and on access to cleaner shared fleets. There's been some really interesting discussions about innovations. I know I've been in touch with Enterprise about some of the ideas they've had on, getting people to share the vehicle domestically for lift share trips to work. The vehicle's then available in a pool when it's at work, and when it's back at home, it's a car club vehicle, not an individual asset. And so we could get a lot more sharing through thinking collectively about the homework joining up, rather than it all being workplace schemes or all being home-based schemes, but actually thinking about people's whole life utilization of vehicles and access. And I think that opens up opportunities in areas where car club vehicles are not viable in the model of just putting stuff out on the street, but they become viable as a part of a community asset. So I think that there are some interesting things there. And then finally, parking policy, really difficult. Local authorities are going to be under the cosh for money, but that just reduces the incentives to get rid of parking spaces. If we want more shared mobility, we want people to be driving less, we need fewer cars in order to meet our climate commitments. Actually, we need less parking. And we've got to step away from that at some point. So, I don't know quite what the right scheme for that is, but we've somehow got to wean local authorities off that and provide some other way of recycling benefits from shared mobility into the local authority system, and find that kind of balancing act.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to thank you for that. I'm going to move on to some of the questions that are coming through, which will carry on sort of this element of the discussion, really. There's a couple of questions which are related to getting electric cars into the shared fleets. So as a general question, what are the prospects for that? What are the barriers for that? Specifically also, and I was interested in this, can you, Richard, just expand on what you said at the very beginning, I think it was, about the recent OZEV policy excluding car clubs? What did that mean? So anything sort of related to using car clubs to pull through electrification, but also the prospects for those being good for the business model case.
Yes, thanks. So there's there's something really important here. I think there is a danger with EVs generally. Following on from what Greg was saying, there's a real danger here with these things, that the bigger cost is on the acquisition side. As you rightly said, Gillian, that's then smeared across monthly payments, which rather makes it dissolve. And I think that's possibly part of the answer to our previous question about why have we got so many cars, etc. I don't think that's been a helpful trend in terms of decarbonisation. But then we've also got the very low use cost and the sort of halo polishing aspect of privately owned EVs, which is still very strong, with government subsidies to purchase, with those green number plates, etc. Really, we need to be aiming at, of course, need to be privately owned EVs and other tailpipe-free vehicles, but we should really be aiming for a big chunk of this to be shared use in this electric future. So some good news and some bad news here again. So the percentage of car club fleet which is electric is far ahead of the general fleet. It's still under 1% of overall cars in Britain, but in the car club fleet we're going up above 10% now, and in some places higher. That's an average figure. People seek these out. So in our latest research, which we haven't published yet, but we're at nearly half of users who've actually used an electric car club car in the last year. So I find this really interesting because what we're also finding, congruent with other years, is that people don't on average use car clubs that much when they're part of them. So this sort of demon of, but this is going to be the kind of methadone to the heroin, this is just going to habituate people to car use, and then they're going to go and buy their own car. I struggle to reconcile that with what we see again and again, which is people use them for specific use cases and not that much. So the most ticked option is 1 to 5 times a year. So given they're not using these things so many times, it's interesting that so many have gone and used the electric ones, so far beyond the proportion they make up of the overall fleet. So basically people must be seeking these out to some extent and seeing what they're like. So car clubs therefore being a really good introducer to EVs, and people really like them. So the satisfaction ratings are very, very high, although they're much lower with the charging infrastructure. But in terms of the actual EVs themselves, this is a way for them to try them, and it turns out they like them. It's also cost a way to get EVs out to people, therefore far ahead of what you can get through just private model rollout. The OZIV guidance point is that at the moment, guidance from OZIV, guidance isn't quite the right word. The rules around funding for charge points explicitly excludes car clubs because it excludes commercial fleets. So car clubs ending up falling into, if you like, that category. And hopefully there's a job of work that we're trying to do here to unpick that and work out how we can get some dedicated chargers, some preferential access. We're not calling for all charge points should be given over to car clubs and none for privately owned cars. There'll need to be a balance. But at the moment, through that and through the way state aid rules have been applied also, through a number of factors, it's ended up with there being very, very little EV charge point infrastructure that's dedicated to car sharing. There's the odd bit and bob, but not much.
Does it require... so there's the hard infrastructure side of it. Does it require different types of charger? Does it require different types of different payment systems? I mean, what is it that it needs that's different?
Yes, all of the above. Once you're through can fleets get reliable access to it in a way that works for their business models, that doesn't drive up costs and therefore reduce provision, reduce viability and so on, then you're into the same set of issues basically that every consumer of EV charge points has got. So interoperability, simplicity of payment, not having a multiplicity of different apps and payment systems to navigate, and making all that as simple, transparent, reliable as possible.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Greg, I'm just going to come to you and ask about the real prospects here. You've recently done some work analysing enterprise car club data and looking at the scope, the scale of the emissions savings that could take place. I mean, what's the real contribution that car clubs could? Or let's talk about sharing. We should broaden this out. That sharing could make in the time that we have available.
I'll flip it back maybe a little bit to some of the work that you and colleagues presented to the Commission, which was, a third of cars aren't moving in a given day. The maximum amount of the whole vehicle fleet that's on the move at any point during a week is 14%, which was at, 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning or whatever. So, there's huge scope for that in just in a purely operational sense, right? But obviously you've got the kind of social norms, the coordination of people's journey patterns and so on. But, if you look at what goes on in some of the better companies that have managed to do this, they get huge carbon savings and huge parking savings. And I'll let the companies that are on the chat kind of post the best results that they've managed to achieve. But that's all through working as a community around a shared problem, and delivering a different kind of social outcome. So I don't know what the limit on it is, but it's certainly not. My concern is we approach the limit on it, or the Committee on Climate Change or the department approaches the limit on the basis of looking at what's been achieved with policies to date. Well, not as much as it could have done, because they haven't really imagined what could be created. And if that's the scale of our imagination, we'll never feel that we could push beyond.
No, but I think I do worry that the conversation still stays at the theoretical level a lot. That yes, we do understand the gross inefficiency that is built into our transport system. The amount of idle tin boxes that are left sitting there for the majority of the time, the sunk costs in that system, etc. So we can talk about things theoretically, but the main nub of the problem from the point of view of accelerating our achievement of whether it's decarbonisation or other environmental and social goals of really reducing the amount of vehicles that are out there, ultimately the biggest issue is around the desire for that individuals have to own their own cars. And beyond restructuring the costs, how quickly can we really shift the norms toward the idea that ownership is not the desirable thing that it's hailed to be?
Well, I think for some, ownership is going to continue to be a desirable thing, and I think we do need to plan that into our kind of transport futures. The idea that everything is going to be shared is, that's just absolutism in the other direction. But yeah, how quickly could we go? I mean, some parts of the country we looked at, local government is like almost a third of employment. Then if you add on health, and other sectors, I mean, that's not true everywhere, but then, you've also got other big companies that are keen to do things differently. Actually, the scale of the opportunity to leverage behavior change through beyond an appeal to the individual is actually still quite large. I know I'm back in the theoretical, but in some senses I'm not, because we've been there with commuter travel planning to some degree. We've got some new tools, we've got some new technologies. Can we put together compelling offers that go beyond just your trip to work to your kind of whole life? I don't know. We seem to be happy to imagine autonomous vehicles and to take that as a given thing that will happen. We that's still a theoretical, but we're that's very much being talked about. Yeah. Still well below the niche of sharing. So why can't we be more ambitious in this space?
No, I totally agree. Richard, is there any evidence on this idea that where there are these, say, mobility, whether it might be through a mobility hub or not, but where there's a good provision of a variety of options, and that might be a variety of different types of car within one car club or across a number of car clubs if you're in an area and have got multiple options. Is there any evidence to suggest that there's a growing status around the idea that, well, isn't this fantastic? I've got access to a van one day and an EV another day and a e-bike another day. Is there something that we can at least see is becoming aspirational to have access to that kind of flexibility?
So that's definitely the reality that people report to us, and it's something I want us to bring more voice to, is the individual user experience and positivity, because the positivity is overwhelming when we do our research. And we, I think, certainly as Como, but others, could do with more of surfacing that. And in particular, I think getting through to politicians and those around them that this is stuff people broadly like very much and want to do use when they realise it's there and it works for them. Whereas actually, when you think of lots of the measures that you end up talking about in relation to decarbonisation, from politicians' point of view, lots of them start looking pretty unappetising pretty quickly. So there absolutely is something about that. We have lots of, really sort of heartwarming case study quotes about the stuff that it enables people to do. I'm taking your question sort of, is it mainstream aspirational, is it in our sort of national dialogue in some way this is aspirational? I'd say on the whole, no, I don't think we are there yet. I think we have a sort of rather tired legacy aspiration around private car ownership, which is nothing like as strong as it used to be, but it's still there, still quite powerful. Public transport use has become more aspirational in some senses, some places. You look at the rail use graph pre-COVID and so on. We haven't got so much on the shared side of things. I think though this is where this next couple of years, even probably in terms of the narrative from particularly central government, matters enormously. And building on some of the questions in the chat, there's a missing space here basically where they talk about the need to improve occupancy, the need to share this stuff more. This is not part of the narrative output from central government. It is increasingly becoming part of it from next level down. Scottish government is starting to get some of this. It's got a kilometrage reduction target, for example, and starting to see some of these things come in. But it's not mainstream there. So I think it could really do with that, because that would probably then unlock quite a lot more of this positivity and people realizing, oh, actually, stuff, it does work. Yes, this is good. I can fit my life around this.
Yeah, I think you're right. And there's questions about, is there any sign of the Department for Transport developing a shared mobility strategy? You've mentioned Scotland and their car kilometre reduction target, but they don't mention ownership of vehicles. The Climate Change Committee's recent 6th budget report finally suggests that it's going to be necessary to reduce car use, but actually maintains in its models quite a large projected growth in the size of the fleet. So essentially, it is in a what's supposed to be a flagship climate policy, suggesting that it's okay to own more of these vehicles with horrendous embedded emissions and use them less. So that there is just no narrative around.
That's right. There's not much. CCC in the 6th budget, at least it talks about car clubs in there. So we've sort of made a bit of progress.
It does, yeah.
As you absolutely rightly say, long way to go, and they're a classic of it is not yet mainstream in their thinking. We're engaged with them and trying to shift that. The Welsh Transport Strategy was an interesting one. To my knowledge, that was the first where it tied a goal of reducing individual car ownership, sadly without numbers and specifics on it yet, but it is an overall strategy. And it ties that explicitly into shared options, all in the one sentence. So these few little glimmers, but these are little sort of initial green shoots in the desert, if you like, aren't they, of where we should really be looking at a garden. Yeah.
And Greg, I've got to give you 1 minute for the last word, just before I hand over to Becky for final word.
Well, I think it's been a really interesting discussion, Gillian. I mean, I think that there are lots and lots of different points that we could move on to advance shared mobility, but yeah, it worries me that who's responsible for that. And we've got so many good innovators and innovative companies. We've got Como UK. I think we've got councils with a groundswell of like wanting to do this. It just feels like we're not like lighting the touch paper, and we could do, but I'm afraid in the beginning there was income. Following income was car ownership. That's the Department for Transport's approach to modelling future travel demand. Unless we engage with the fact that actually we should be open to a shrinking fleet rather than a growing fleet, and that doesn't mean that we're all sat at home all the time. It just needs a massive mind shift.
It does. And that reminds me of a great question that I could have asked, which is about job creation, because everything at the moment to me seems to be needing to be weighed up against job losses and creation rather than carbon. So thank you very much, both of you. Really enjoyed it. Could have gone on for another hour or two, I'm sure. And thanks to everybody for great questions that I didn't get to, but maybe Richard and Greg can answer in other ways. So thanks.
Thanks, Gillian, Greg, Richard. Fascinating conversation. So many interesting points. A couple of things that stood out to me. That stat, 44% of people carried on driving to work through the lockdown, and that they tended to be lower income. There's huge opportunities there for workplaces to target that market and maybe expand shared mobility into some different demographics. And for the 50% who are working from home, there's opportunities there too, to offer an alternative to the idle tin box, as you described it, Gillian. Also, the need to better understand car occupancy, and that we've been focused far too much on optimising the movements of vehicles rather than people, and the idea that we should see that ambition that's applied to autonomous vehicle policy applied to shared mobility, which is much more achievable and very much in keeping with the green recovery. And finally, just to give a plug to the report that Greg mentioned a few times, the Shared Mobility Where Now, Where Next report, in case you didn't get the message, that it's well worth a read. The link is in the chat. I hope you'll be able to join us again for Urban Transport Next 6, where we'll be talking to TransLink Group CEO Chris Conway about Northern Ireland's public transport transformation. That's on Thursday the 3rd of June at 12 p.m. In the meantime, thanks again to our fabulous panel and to everyone who took part live or watched later. Thank you and goodbye.